the president who trusted his own judgment more than his generals. When the U-2 photographs were laid before President John F. Kennedy on the morning of October 16, 1962, the United States entered the most dangerous period in its history. The images, stark and undeniable, revealed Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles on Cuban soil, missiles capable of striking Washington, New York, and the industrial heart of the American Northeast in minutes. The national security machinery that had been built over the previous decade instantly shifted into crisis posture. Yet what unfolded during the days that followed was not simply a confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a confrontation within the U.S. government itself, between a president who understood the stakes in uniquely political and existential terms, and a military establishment whose assumptions were shaped by decades of Cold War orthodoxy. From the outset, Kennedy perceived the truth the chiefs did not fully acknowledge. The Cuban Missile Crisis was not merely a tactical challenge, but a systemic test of nuclear stability. The deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba represented a strategic rebalancing deliberately engineered by Nikita Khrushchev. It challenged U.S. credibility, threatened domestic political collapse if mishandled, and risked igniting a nuclear exchange if approached through conventional Cold War playbooks. The military, shaped by doctrines of overwhelming force, responded to the revelation with a narrow set of options, overwhelmingly kinetic, decisive, and irreversible. Kennedy's response emerged from a broader evaluation. He saw a world in which miscalculation, not malice, was the most immediate threat. The Pentagon's posture was predictable but nonetheless alarming in its certainty. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, led by Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay and dominated by officers who had fought World War II in Korea, believed the Soviet provocation required a forceful and immediate response. They favored an air strike to eliminate the missiles, followed by an invasion of Cuba to remove Castro's regime. They argued that anything less constituted appeasement. Their worldview had been forged in conflicts where overwhelming force decided outcomes. The nuclear age, in which small decisions could produce irreversible catastrophe, did not reshape their instincts as profoundly as it had reshaped Kennedy's. Kennedy entered office after the Bay of Pigs disaster, an operation he approved reluctantly and regretted profoundly. That failure taught him a lesson the military establishment never fully absorbed. Experts operating within their own institutional logic are capable of generating strategic disasters when unchecked. The Joint Chiefs had assured him that Cuban resistance would collapse, that political consequences would be manageable, and that American involvement could be concealed. None of those assurances survived contact with reality. Kennedy internalized the experience as a warning about the limits of military judgment. When the missile crisis erupted, that memory remained vivid, guiding his skepticism toward aggressive plans that promised decisive outcomes without acknowledging catastrophic risks. This skepticism intensified as Kennedy examined the strategic landscape. A U.S. first strike might destroy some installations, but would almost certainly miss others. Surviving missiles could be launched in retaliation. The Soviets, faced with an attack on Cuba, a client state under their patronage, might respond in Berlin, igniting a conflict where NATO would be forced to act. Kennedy understood that the Soviet presence in Cuba was not merely a tactical threat, but a political signal. Khrushchev had chosen Cuba because it represented the one theater where the United States appeared vulnerable. For years, the U.S. had stationed nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy, directly threatening Soviet territory. From Moscow's perspective, Cuba represented symmetrical deterrence. To Kennedy, that symmetry was dangerous but rational. To the military, it was intolerable. The chief's recommendations reflected this rigidity. They viewed inaction as weakness. They saw Soviet missiles as an immediate threat that required immediate elimination. They believed that failure to act decisively would signal to the world that the United States had lost its resolve. Their advice was grounded in military logic, but detached from political context. Kennedy recognized something the chiefs did not. The American public, Congress, and the international community would interpret any action not simply in terms of strength, but in terms of legitimacy. An unprovoked attack, especially one that killed Soviet personnel, would risk shattering the alliances the United States relied upon. It would shift global opinion against Washington and frame the U.S. as the aggressor in a rapidly escalating nuclear crisis. Kennedy also perceived the psychological dimensions of the confrontation. Khrushchev was unpredictable but not reckless. His decision to place missiles in Cuba reflected strategic desperation rather than a desire for war. The Soviet Union lagged behind the United States in long-range missile development. Cuba offered a way to compensate. Kennedy understood that Khrushchev needed an escape route, one that protected Soviet prestige while lowering the temperature. A military strike offered no such route. It cornered the Soviet leadership, forcing them either to accept humiliation or escalate. The chiefs saw this as an opportunity for decisive advantage. Kennedy saw it as a path to uncontrollable destruction. The president's approach to crisis management therefore diverged sharply from the Pentagon's. He saw time to understand Soviet intentions, time to assemble international support, time to probe for diplomatic solutions. The chiefs equated time with danger. They believed that delay increased the likelihood of a Soviet preemptive launch or additional deployments. They viewed patience as passivity, and passivity as defeat. Kennedy viewed patience as the only tool capable of preventing catastrophe. But the deeper rift between Kennedy and the military stemmed from their incompatible philosophies of power. The Pentagon perceived the crisis through the lens of deterrence. Failure to act decisively would undermine credibility. Kennedy perceived it through the lens of survival. Failure to avoid miscalculation would destroy civilization. The chiefs believed credibility hinged on showing willingness to use force. Kennedy believed credibility hinged on demonstrating control in the face of provocation. The chiefs believed victory required eliminating the threat. Kennedy believed victory required preventing the threat from escalating into nuclear war. This divergence grew more pronounced as intelligence assessments revealed the accelerating pace of Soviet construction. The Pentagon interpreted each development as justification for an immediate strike. Kennedy interpreted the same developments as evidence of how little time remained to avert disaster. The military's planning documents, infused with confidence in American superiority, framed invasion as straightforward. Kennedy reviewed casualty estimates, logistical assumptions, and contingency scenarios with mounting alarm. He saw what the chiefs did not, that even a successful invasion guaranteed a nuclear exchange elsewhere. As the crisis deepened, Kennedy faced not only Soviet missiles, but the machinery of his own government. The Pentagon's confidence masked a deeper institutional momentum. Military planning had long been oriented toward decisive action. Its culture rewarded decisiveness and viewed caution as hesitancy. Kennedy was forced to contend with an apparatus that had internalized a strategic worldview incompatible with nuclear reality. The chiefs, certain that they understood the nature of the conflict better than a young president, spoke with the authority of decades of military experience. Kennedy, aware of the weight of their opinions, nonetheless questioned their assumptions more vigorously with each meeting. It was in this context that Kennedy made the choice that defined the crisis. He rejected the military's recommendations for air strikes and invasion, opting instead for a naval quarantine, an action that combined strategic pressure with diplomatic flexibility. The chiefs saw the quarantine as dangerously insufficient. Kennedy saw it as the only option that left room for negotiation while signaling American resolve. The blockade offered a mechanism for controlling escalation rather than initiating it. It shifted responsibility onto the Soviets, forcing Khrushchev to decide whether to breach the quarantine or seek compromise. The decision was not an act of passivity, but an assertion of presidential authority over a military establishment conditioned to imagine only escalation as strength. Kennedy understood that the chief's worldview was shaped by wars in which risk was bounded by conventional limits. In nuclear conflict, those limits no longer existed. By ignoring the chiefs, Kennedy was not undermining the military. He was redefining the meaning of national security. The first phase of the crisis, dominated by surveillance, internal debate, and strategic preparation, revealed the fault lines between the president and his generals. The next phase, as the blockade went into effect and the Soviet response took shape, would expose how these competing philosophies would collide under the pressure of imminent nuclear exchange. The collision course. When Kennedy's restraint met the general's certainty. When President Kennedy ordered the naval quarantine of Cuba on October 22, 1962, he initiated a confrontation not only with the Soviet Union, but with the full weight of America's strategic machine. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, who had already deemed the blockade insufficient, now viewed the situation as confirmation that the president had chosen a path of unacceptable hesitation. Within the Pentagon, frustration hardened into disbelief. To the chiefs, the quarantine was a half measure, a gesture of caution in a moment demanding decisiveness. To Kennedy, it was the only action that preserved control while preventing an irreversible chain of events. As the U.S. Navy moved into position, the chiefs braced for the moment they believed would vindicate their warnings. Soviet ships approaching the quarantine line, forcing Kennedy to either turn them back by force or accept a humiliating breach. The Pentagon expected confrontation, escalation, and a rapid transition to the airstrikes, an invasion they had long recommended. Their assumptions reflected a worldview in which the opponent must be compelled through superior strength, and where negotiation appeared merely as a slower form of capitulation. But Kennedy's calculus extended beyond the operational details of the quarantine. He recognized that the confrontation's outcome would be shaped by perceptions as much as by ships and missiles. By making the blockade public and legally framing it as a quarantine, he had transformed the crisis into a test of legitimacy. If the United States struck first, it would bear the burden of escalation. If the Soviet Union challenged the blockade, it would be seen as the aggressor. Kennedy understood that the Cold War's diplomatic terrain mattered as much as the military one, and he crafted a response that forced international opinion to align with the United States. Inside the Pentagon, however, this approach was met with growing irritation. Generals accustomed to clear military objectives now faced a strategy built on ambiguity and controlled escalation. They interpreted Kennedy's restraint as an unwillingness to confront hard truths. Their view of deterrence demanded unambiguous shows of force. Kennedy's view of nuclear reality demanded flexibility. This divergence reflected more than different preferences. It reflected different eras. The chiefs had been shaped by a time when wars were won through decisive action. Kennedy belonged to a generation that understood that wars in the nuclear age could not be won at all. As reconnaissance flights intensified over Cuba, the Pentagon grew even more restless. New images showed Soviet missiles nearing operational readiness. To the chiefs, this confirmed the urgency of their preferred course: a sudden and overwhelming strike to eliminate the installations before they became fully armed. They urged Kennedy to act before the missiles could be launched, framing delay as strategic dereliction. But Kennedy saw what they did not. Striking now would kill Soviet personnel and force Khrushchev into retaliation. The possibility of nuclear exchange was no longer hypothetical. If the Soviets perceived the attacks as the opening blow of a broader invasion, they might interpret them as a prelude to regime change. In such a scenario, escalation to nuclear war would not be a choice but a reaction. This gap in perception revealed a profound structural flaw in America's Cold War posture. Military planning had long been dominated by assumptions of escalation dominance, the belief that the United States could outmatch the Soviets at every rung of a ladder. Kennedy understood that the ladder itself was unstable. The chiefs saw strength as a stabilizer. Kennedy saw strength, if misapplied, as a trigger. As the blockade continued, Soviet ships slowed or reversed course, dispelling the Pentagon's expectations of immediate confrontation. For Kennedy, this was an early sign that Khrushchev was seeking maneuvering room. For the chiefs, it was a delay that changed little. They believed the Soviets were buying time to complete missile construction. They suspected the apparent de-escalation was a mask for preparation. Their proposals reflected this suspicion, increasing reconnaissance flights, preparing for rapid airstrikes, and mobilizing invasion forces in Florida. In Kennedy's mind, however, increasing military pressure without clear necessity risked collapsing the fragile balance. He recognized that every action, even one intended to avoid conflict, could be misinterpreted as aggression. The president's caution emerged not from weakness, but from acute awareness of the crisis' volatility. Yet to the chiefs, each refusal to escalate became further evidence of civilian timidity. This tension sharpened during the analysis of Soviet broadcasts, diplomatic cables, and intelligence intercepts. The Pentagon interpreted Moscow's mixed messages as signs of Soviet duplicity. Kennedy and his closest advisors saw them as evidence of internal strain within the Kremlin. Khrushchev was operating under enormous pressure from the Politburo, from the Chinese, and from his own gamble's potential failure. Kennedy sensed that the Soviet leader needed a dignified exit, not a confrontation that left him cornered. The chiefs, steeped in Cold War orthodoxy, viewed such interpretations as naive. But what most widened the chasm between Kennedy and the military was not their differing views of Soviet intentions. It was Kennedy's willingness to question the very assumptions upon which American strategy had been built. During crisis meetings, Kennedy repeatedly pushed intelligence analysts to consider how the Soviets viewed U.S. actions. The chiefs recoiled at this approach. They believed that strategy should be guided by American capabilities, not by assumptions about the enemy's psychology. Yet Kennedy understood that in a nuclear crisis, perceptions could become reality. Misinterpretation could lead to catastrophe, even when neither side desired conflict. This philosophical divide reached a breaking point as the Pentagon presented casualty projections for a Cuban invasion. Kennedy examined the estimates with growing alarm, recognizing that even the most optimistic scenarios included thousands of American deaths and likely tens of thousands of Cuban casualties. More troubling were the intelligence assessments, suggesting that Soviet tactical nuclear weapons might already be in Cuba, under local commanders' control. The chiefs dismissed these possibilities as improbable. Kennedy saw them as entirely plausible. As the days progressed, Kennedy's distrust of military advice deepened. The chiefs' confidence seemed disconnected from the crisis' fragility. Their planning reflected a worldview shaped by conventional war, even as the world balanced on the precipice of mutual annihilation. Kennedy was forced to confront the unsettling reality that the machinery designed to protect the United States was capable of propelling it toward disaster if left unchecked. Meanwhile, the Soviets continued constructing their missile sites, and reconnaissance flights revealed anti-aircraft defenses increasing in density. Pressure mounted on Kennedy from Congress, from the public, and from within his own administration. Yet even as doubts surrounded him, Kennedy held firm in his conviction that military force must remain the last resort, not the first. He recognized that once initiated, no military action in this crisis could be controlled with confidence. This conviction guided his decision to maintain back-channel communications with Moscow. While the Pentagon dismissed such channels as unreliable, Kennedy saw them as essential. They provided insight into Khrushchev's thinking and offered potential pathways toward compromise without public humiliation. The chiefs, however, interpreted these diplomatic maneuvers as distractions from decisive action. By the end of the first week of the crisis, the Pentagon's frustration had hardened into something more dangerous, a belief that the president's caution could lead to a strategic disaster. They believed Kennedy was allowing Soviet missiles to become operational. They feared that restraint now would embolden the Soviets elsewhere. They suspected that political concern was overriding national security. Kennedy, however, saw the crisis through a different lens. Every day without escalation was a day in which the world remained intact. Every moment of restraint gave the Soviets another chance to reconsider. Every avoided strike kept open the possibility of resolution. The second phase of the crisis, defined by Kennedy's refusal to take the military's advice and his search for an alternative path, was approaching its most perilous moment. The world would soon move from tense standoff to imminent confrontation. And in those final days, the conflict between Kennedy and his generals would reach its peak. revealing just how close the United States came to catastrophe not through Soviet aggression, but through internal pressures within its own government. The breaking point, when the generals' pressure threatened to push the U.S. toward nuclear war. As the Cuban Missile Crisis entered its second and most perilous week, the tension inside the American government reached a level unseen in any previous Cold War confrontation. The Joint Chiefs of Staff, convinced that the blockade had served its limited purpose, pressed harder than ever for decisive military action. Each day that passed seemed, to them, like a day in which American credibility weakened and Soviet missile sites grew closer to operational readiness. Their internal communications reflected urgency bordering on alarm. Airstrikes, followed by invasion, were necessary before the balance tipped irreversibly. Kennedy, however, saw the situation through a far more complex lens, shaped by political, diplomatic, and existential considerations the military had not fully internalized. The Pentagon's sense of urgency was not irrational. Aerial reconnaissance revealed unmistakable signs that Soviet missile crews were completing their launch capabilities. Surface-to-air missile sites were hardening, and transport vehicles were dispersing. From the chief's perspective, the crisis had entered a narrow window. Act now, or lose the opportunity to eliminate the missiles before they became operational. Their logic was grounded in classical military assessment. Destroy the threat before it becomes active. But this logic existed in a world fundamentally different from the one in which the Cuban Missile Crisis was unfolding. Kennedy understood that striking operational or near-operational Soviet missiles risked triggering retaliatory launches rather than preventing them. Inside the White House, the tension between civilian leadership and military command intensified as intelligence briefings painted an increasingly ominous picture. What Kennedy grasped, and what the chiefs did not fully appreciate, was the psychological dimension of Soviet behavior. The more the United States pushed militarily, the narrower Khrushchev's options became. Kennedy feared that cornering the Soviet leader with airstrikes or invasion would force him into a position where escalation became the only means to preserve credibility, both internationally and domestically. The chiefs viewed such concerns as speculative. Kennedy viewed them as unavoidable realities of nuclear brinkmanship. In these days, the crisis shifted from a strategic contest to a struggle over interpretation. The Pentagon believed the Soviets had placed missiles in Cuba with the intention of altering the global balance of power. Kennedy believed Khrushchev's move had been a gamble meant to compensate for Soviet missile inferiority, not the opening move of a broader offensive. The chiefs saw Soviet actions as aggressive. Kennedy saw them as reactive. The chiefs viewed American restraint as dangerous. Kennedy viewed it as the only safeguard against catastrophe. But the most dangerous element of this internal division emerged in the chiefs' growing willingness to assume that war, if it came, could be controlled. They believed American superiority guaranteed dominance at every level of escalation. The president saw escalation itself as the enemy. He recognized that the very concept of limited nuclear war was a contradiction. The military's confidence rested on contingency plans written in a calmer era, not on the realities of a crisis where two nuclear-armed superpowers were staring directly at each other. Kennedy suspected, and later confirmed, that the more he probed these plans, the less reliable they appeared. Compounding these differences was the political pressure surrounding Kennedy. Members of Congress, unaware of the crisis' full scope, criticized the president for acting too slowly. Hawks in both parties demanded force, believing Soviet provocation required an overwhelming demonstration of American power. The public, fueled by news of the blockade and partial government disclosures, grew increasingly anxious. Kennedy faced not only the Soviet challenge, but the domestic expectation that the United States would not tolerate threats so close to its shores. The chiefs understood these pressures and believed decisive action would satisfy them. Kennedy understood that such action might satisfy the public for a day and destroy the world a day later. As the Monday to Friday sequence of the second week unfolded, the crisis evolved with disturbing speed. A U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet SAM battery, killing the pilot. For the chiefs, this event was the long-feared tipping point. They believed the attack represented a deliberate escalation. Calls for retaliation intensified, and internal documents reveal that several officers believed the downing required immediate airstrikes. Kennedy, however, doubted that the order had come from Moscow. His instincts were correct. The shoot-down was later traced to a local commander acting without direct authorization. But at the time, Kennedy had to make a decision without complete information. His refusal to retaliate infuriated the chiefs, who saw restraint in the face of American casualties as strategic paralysis. The crisis deepened further when an American reconnaissance flight over the Arctic strayed unintentionally into Soviet airspace, prompting a Soviet scramble. At the same time, U.S. nuclear forces moved to DEFCON 2, the highest alert short of war, raising fears in Moscow that the United States was preparing a first strike. Khrushchev interpreted these moves not as routine escalation, but as signals of imminent attack. Kennedy, reviewing intelligence reports, realized that the crisis had reached a point where any misstep could be fatal. The more he studied the situation, the clearer it became that the United States was now in a condition where the military's preferred course of action, airstrikes and invasion, would almost certainly trigger nuclear retaliation. The internal dynamics worsened as the Pentagon increasingly framed Kennedy's restraint as indecisiveness. The chief's private memoranda showed deep frustration, even contempt. They believed the president was overestimating Soviet rationality and underestimating the risk of losing strategic advantage. But Kennedy saw the inverse. The Pentagon was overestimating America's ability to control events and underestimating the Soviets' fear of being humiliated. Each side perceived the other as blind to the crisis' true nature. In private analysis sessions, Kennedy revisited the lessons of World War I, where mobilization cycles and rigid military planning created a conflict that no political leader wished to fight. He saw uncanny parallels in 1962. The U.S. military machine was designed to dominate, not to pause. The crisis had exposed an institutional logic that pushed inevitably toward escalation. It was not malicious, it was structural. Kennedy understood that the president's role in such a system was not merely to command, but to restrain. Meanwhile, Khrushchev's messages to Washington grew increasingly contradictory, reflecting the chaos inside the Soviet leadership. Some communications hinted at willingness to negotiate. Others suggested hardening resolve. The chiefs interpreted the inconsistency as manipulation. Kennedy saw it as evidence of a divided Soviet leadership searching for a way out. His reading of the situation proved accurate, but convincing the military establishment of this interpretation required a level of nuance they were not prepared to accept in the midst of crisis. The decisive test came when the Soviets proposed a deal: removal of missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. pledge not to invade the island. Shortly afterward, a second, more aggressive proposal arrived, demanding removal of American Jupiter missiles from Turkey. The chiefs rejected both proposals, arguing that negotiating under threat would erode American credibility. Kennedy, however, recognized that the first message represented Khrushchev's real position, and the second reflected internal pressure. The Pentagon viewed concessions as surrender. Kennedy saw them as the price of survival. This was the moment when Kennedy's refusal to follow the military's advice saved not only the United States, but civilization itself. Had he pursued the chief's preferred strategy, air strikes followed by invasion, the Soviets would have responded in Berlin or Turkey, triggering a NATO crisis and likely nuclear use. The chiefs believed Soviet restraint could be relied upon. Kennedy knew restraint could collapse the moment one nervous radar operator or frightened commander misinterpreted a signal. The president's decision to pursue a diplomatic settlement through a dual-track approach, publicly accepting the first Soviet offer and privately agreeing to remove the Jupiters later, reflected a mastery of crisis management that the Pentagon could not replicate within its own frameworks. It was a solution that preserved Soviet dignity, satisfied American security needs, and prevented escalation. The chiefs, reviewing the outcome later, remained convinced that military action would have succeeded. Kennedy understood that success was not defined by victory, but by survival. The third phase of the crisis thus revealed the essential truth that guided Kennedy's actions. A nuclear world required new forms of leadership that transcended the instincts of traditional military doctrine. The Pentagon's desire for decisive action was born of a worldview unsuited to nuclear brinkmanship. Kennedy's restraint was born of a recognition that the Cold War's logic demanded avoiding pathways that historical military experience would normally encourage. The final part of this story, the resolution of the crisis and its long-term implications, would expose how deeply Kennedy's rejection of military advice reshaped U.S. nuclear policy, and why his decisions remain among the most consequential in human history. The choice that saved the world. Why ignoring the generals was Kennedy's greatest act of leadership. When dawn broke on October 28, 1962, the world was still suspended between peace and devastation. In both Washington and Moscow, the preceding days had pushed leaders to the brink of choices from which there would be no return. What had begun as a contest of wills between two nuclear superpowers had quickly evolved into a test of human judgment under unimaginable pressure. In the United States, that judgment rested not with the machinery of the Pentagon, but with a president who understood that avoiding catastrophe required resisting the institutional logic that had governed American strategy since the dawn of the Cold War. Kennedy's final decisions during the crisis did more than avert nuclear war. They redefined the limits of military authority and established a precedent for presidential restraint in the atomic age. The resolution of the crisis took shape through a combination of public firmness and private concession, a dual-track approach that balanced geopolitical imperatives with the psychological constraints of international leadership. Kennedy publicly accepted Khrushchev's first offer, removal of Soviet missiles in Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade the island. Privately, he agreed to remove the Jupiter missiles from Turkey within a matter of months. This secret concession, kept hidden from the American public and from most of the Pentagon, was the final element required to provide Khrushchev with a face-saving exit. Without it, the Soviet leader would have faced an internal crisis as destabilizing as the one facing Kennedy. With it, he could present the outcome as a negotiated settlement rather than a capitulation. Inside the Pentagon, the reaction to this arrangement was deeply conflicted. Many officers believed the United States had given up a strategic asset for symbolic prestige. Others saw the deal as unnecessary appeasement. Most were unaware of the Turkey concession and interpreted the settlement as Soviet retreat in the face of American resolve. Kennedy understood that secrecy was essential. The credibility of NATO, the cohesion of U.S. alliances, and the domestic political climate could not withstand the revelation that America had traded away forward-deployed missiles. The president justified this secrecy not as manipulation, but as responsible stewardship. He believed that the survival of civilization required decisions made not for political gain, but for global stability. Even as the crisis unwound, the rift between Kennedy and the military establishment persisted. The chiefs did not fully accept Kennedy's logic and maintained, even afterward, that their preferred course, air strikes and invasion, would have eliminated the threat and preserved American dominance. They believed that Moscow would not have escalated, that American nuclear superiority provided a protective shield. Kennedy saw this belief as dangerously misguided. In his view, the crisis had revealed a truth the military had not yet accepted. Nuclear superiority did not translate into nuclear control. The survivability of even a small number of Soviet missiles rendered any full-scale conflict unwinnable. A single Soviet launch against an American city would constitute a strategic failure beyond comprehension. This difference in worldview became increasingly clear as the president reflected on the crisis in the weeks that followed. The Pentagon prepared reports evaluating the blockade, reviewing intelligence gaps, and analyzing the Soviet withdrawal. Kennedy requested something else, a study on how miscommunication had nearly triggered disaster. He wanted to understand how the downing of a U-2, the accidental incursion into Soviet airspace, and the escalation to DEFCON 2 had shaped Soviet decision-making. His focus was not on military performance, but on the system's vulnerabilities. The chiefs, however, produced assessments emphasizing American strength. Kennedy saw in this a fundamental disconnect between the Pentagon's self-perception and the reality of nuclear brinkmanship. The president's private reflections reveal a profound shift in his thinking. The crisis had not simply confirmed his skepticism of military advice. It had convinced him that the foundational assumptions of Cold War strategy were flawed. He now believed that nuclear weapons had changed the nature of power itself, transforming traditional notions of victory and defeat into obsolete concepts. Deterrence remained necessary, but only as a stabilizing mechanism, not as a template for national triumph. Kennedy's approach to national security, once shaped by Cold War orthodoxy, had evolved into something more modern, more cautious, and more attuned to the fragility of global systems. The Pentagon struggled to adapt to this shift. The chiefs saw nuclear superiority as the foundation of American power. They believed that maintaining the ability to launch and win a nuclear exchange was essential. Kennedy increasingly viewed that notion as absurd. Winning a nuclear war in any meaningful sense was impossible. The Pentagon's confidence in escalation dominance was a dangerous illusion. The president realized that the crisis had been averted not because of American military superiority, but because he refused to act on advice that would have triggered catastrophe. This realization deepened Kennedy's determination to create structures that would limit the likelihood of future crises. His administration pursued the establishment of direct communication between Washington and Moscow, the hotline, to prevent misunderstandings. He pushed for a nuclear test ban treaty, recognizing that reducing tensions required cooperation, not confrontation. These initiatives signaled a profound philosophical break with the doctrines of the 1950s. They represented a move toward coexistence rather than perpetual brinkmanship. The chiefs, however, viewed such efforts with skepticism, seeing them as concessions to Soviet manipulation. The deeper significance of Kennedy's decision-making during the crisis lies not merely in what he chose, but in what he rejected. By ignoring the generals, he refused to equate strength with action. He refused to allow military logic to override political and human judgment. He recognized that the Pentagon's institutional culture, shaped by wars of overwhelming force, was incompatible with the demands of nuclear diplomacy. He understood that military advice, while essential, could become catastrophic when applied without regard to political psychology, international legitimacy, and existential risk. The crisis also exposed structural weaknesses in the American system. Kennedy discovered that military protocols could escalate a conflict automatically, without deliberate political direction. He saw how alert levels, surveillance missions, and contingency plans operated with inertia that could push the country toward war even when leaders sought restraint. He recognized that generals were conditioned to think in terms of decisive outcomes, not fragile balances. The more he studied these dynamics, the more convinced he became that the president's most important responsibility was not to respond to threats with overwhelming force, but to prevent confrontation from spiraling beyond control. In the months following the crisis, Kennedy spoke privately about how close the world had come to destruction. He understood that his decision to resist the chief's pressure had been the most consequential of his presidency. He believed that if he had responded as his generals urged, catastrophe would have been almost certain. He later reflected that the crisis had taught him the value of empathy in geopolitical decision-making, the ability to see the world not only through one's own strategic lens, but through the eyes of adversaries. This empathetic approach did not weaken American power. It strengthened it by preventing miscalculation. The Pentagon never fully embraced this interpretation. Many officers continued to insist that military action would have succeeded. They viewed Kennedy's restraint as fortunate rather than wise, accidental rather than deliberate. But history has rendered a different judgment. The military's plans, later declassified, revealed fatal flaws. They assumed Soviet passivity, underestimated the probability of retaliatory launches, and ignored the presence of tactical nuclear weapons in Cuba. They revealed an institutional mindset fundamentally unprepared for the realities of nuclear confrontation. Kennedy's legacy in the crisis endures because it exemplifies the essential role of civilian leadership in the nuclear age. He showed that the president's responsibility is not merely to direct military power, but to restrain it when necessary. He demonstrated that survival, not dominance, is the true measure of success in a world where a single miscalculation can end human civilization. By ignoring the generals at the moment when their advice aligned most closely with historical instinct, Kennedy redefined what effective leadership meant. The Cuban Missile Crisis remains the closest humanity has come to nuclear annihilation. And it was averted not by weapons, nor by strategy, nor by doctrine, but by a president who understood that the logic of past wars could not guide the decisions of a world armed with apocalyptic power. Kennedy did not save the world by defeating the Soviet Union. He saved it by refusing to let the momentum of institutions push two nations into destruction. His greatest act of leadership was the recognition that sometimes the only path to victory is the refusal to fight.